The cardboard box was lighter than it should have been for 12 years of work. Wren set it on the sidewalk outside the Revenue Canada building on Elgin Street and stood there for a moment in the November cold, watching her own breath dissolve in the air. Inside that box, a stapler she'd bought herself, 3 pens, a framed photo of her mother at Niagara Falls, and the audit files for 17 shell companies that nobody at the office had wanted to touch. She'd touched them. That was apparently the problem. The wind off the Rideau Canal smelled like ice and dead leaves. Her phone had 3 missed calls from her landlord and a voicemail she hadn't listened to yet. She already knew what it said. The rent was 3 weeks late. She'd been counting on the end-of-quarter bonus that was now, along with her job, her access badge, and her pension contributions, no longer hers. Wren picked up the box and walked to the bus stop. She'd been good at that job. She'd been better than good. She'd been the person they called when the numbers didn't add up, when the trail went cold, when 3 different sets of books had to be reconciled against each other, and nobody could figure out where the variance was hiding. The variance was always hiding somewhere. She'd learned that early. Money didn't disappear. It moved. It changed clothes and crossed the street and sat down somewhere else and pretended it had always been there. She'd found it every time, right up until she'd found it in the wrong place. The bus was late. She stood in the cold and thought about her mother, who had died believing Wren would be fine. "You're the smartest girl I've ever known," her mother had said, near the end, in that small hospital room in Sudbury that smelled like antiseptic and wilting carnations. "You're going to be fine." Wren had been 19. Her mother had been the only person who'd believed that without conditions attached. The bus came, she got on. She rode it to the end of the line. The envelope arrived 11 days later. It was hand-delivered, which should have been her first warning. No postage, no return address, just her name written in a handwriting that looked like it had been taught by someone who believed penmanship was a form of discipline. Each letter deliberate, slightly compressed, nothing inside. A business card, cream stock, heavy enough to be a statement. A single name, Harmon. A phone number, no title. No company, no explanation. On the back, in the same handwriting, "Your work on the Meridian accounts was noticed. Call before Thursday." She knew the Meridian accounts. She'd flagged them 6 months ago, a web of numbered companies cycling funds through real estate and logistics subsidiaries in a pattern that didn't match any legitimate business model she'd ever seen. Her supervisor had told her to close the file. She'd asked why. He'd stopped making eye contact with her after that. She should have thrown the card away. She called on Wednesday. The man who answered didn't introduce himself. He gave her an address in the Glebe, one of those narrow Victorian row houses with the original brick still intact, and a time, 7 o'clock Thursday evening. She said she'd be there. She didn't know why she said it. Later, she would tell herself it was because she was 3 weeks behind on rent, and her EI claim was still processing. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that she wanted to know what she'd actually found in those files. The man who opened the door was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined someone in a suit, someone smooth, with the particular brand of confidence that came from knowing other people needed things from them. She'd worked in government long enough to know that type by sight. They walked differently, like the ground owed them something. The man who opened the door was none of that. He was tall, solidly built in a way that suggested use rather than effort, and he was wearing a grey Henley with the sleeves pushed up. His hair was dark and starting to go silver at the temples. There was a scar that ran from his left cheekbone toward his ear, not fresh, years old, the kind that had long since stopped being something he thought about. His eyes were the particular pale blue of lake ice in February, and they assessed her the way she assessed a ledger, quickly, completely, and without sentiment. "Wren Farris," he said. It wasn't a question. "You're Harmon. Come in." The house was not what she'd expected either. She'd half anticipated marble and intimidation, the aesthetic of someone who needed to be reminded they had money. Instead, it was spare, ordered, functional. Good furniture, nothing showy. Books on actual shelves and organized by subject. A kitchen table with paperwork stacked in precise columns. the kind of space that belonged to someone who didn't need the room to do the work for them. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted any and set one in front of her. She noticed he took his black. She noticed he'd given her the same. She hadn't mentioned how she took her coffee. "You flagged an irregularity in the Meridian accounts," he said, sitting across from her. Not settling, sitting, the way someone sits when they intend to get up again soon. Routing pattern inconsistent with the stated business model. You traced it to 4 intermediary accounts in the Cayman structure before your supervisor closed the file. You know about that. I know you were right. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. I also know you were terminated for a reason that had nothing to do with your performance. Wren looked at him steadily. "What do you want, Mr. Harmon? I have a problem with my books. You should call an accountant." "I have accountants. 3 of them." A pause. The particular kind of pause that meant what came next had been decided before she'd walked in the door. "Someone in my organization has been skimming. 80,000 over 14 months, distributed across 9 subsidiary accounts in a pattern designed to look like routine variants. My accountants have been looking at it for 6 weeks and haven't found the mechanism. How much do you know about what I'm walking into?" she said. "Because I'm going to need you to be specific about that." Something shifted in his face. Not softness. More like the adjustment of a calculation. "More than you'd prefer, probably. Try me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the folder on the table and slid 3 pages across to her. She picked them up. Balance sheets, subsidiary ledgers, routing codes she recognized from her work at Revenue Canada, not identical but the same family of obfuscation. The numbers had a particular signature, rhythm to the variants that she'd seen before in a different context. She set the pages back down. "Whoever set this up used the same layering technique I flagged in the Meridian file," she said. "Yes, which means either they've seen my report, or they trained under the same person who taught whoever built the Meridian structure. Yes, and you need someone who can recognize the pattern. I need someone who already has," he said. "Which is you." Wren sat back in her chair. Outside, a streetcar rumbled past on Bank Street. The coffee in her cup had gone slightly cold. She thought about her mother's hospital room. She thought about the box on the sidewalk outside the Revenue Canada building and how light it had been, and how that lightness had felt like an accusation. "I want to see all of it," she said. "Every subsidiary, every routing code. Access to the original transaction records. Not summaries. And I work alone. Your accountants don't see what I find until I decide they need to. Those are significant demands for someone who hasn't been offered the job yet. You wouldn't have called me if you had other options," she said. "We both know that." He was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted. "You'd be working out of this location," he said. "You'd have access to the files and nothing else, initially. The rest is contingent on what you find." "What's the rate?" he told her. She kept her face neutral. It was more than she'd made in her last 18 months at Revenue Canada combined. "I'll start Monday," she said. She started Monday. The first week, she barely saw him. He came in early. She could tell by the position of the coffee cup and the shifted paperwork, and left after she did, or not at all. She found a folded blanket on the couch in the small sitting room off the main office on the 3rd day, and tried not to think about what that meant about how he spent his nights. The files were a mess in the organized way that only looked like a mess. She sorted them chronologically first, then by entity, then by transaction type, building a map on the spare wall with printed ledger sheets and colored tape until the whole structure was visible in a way that spreadsheets couldn't capture. She needed to see it. She'd always worked like this: revenue inspection, tax disputes, forensic accounting. Numbers existed in space as much as on paper. You had to be able to stand back and look at the shape of them. On the 5th day, Harmon came to stand beside her at the wall. He didn't say anything for a long time. She was used to that by then. He moved quietly for someone his size, and he seemed to have no interest in filling silence. She appreciated it. Most people filled silence with noise that made the thinking harder. "The variance in the Q3 subsidiary accounts," she said, without looking away from the wall. "It's not random. The amounts are random, but the timing isn't. Every third Tuesday within a 72-hour window. Our accountants missed that. Your accountants were looking at amounts. I'm looking at frequency. She pointed to a cluster of entries near the top right of the wall. Whoever's doing this understood that irregular amounts would pass as noise, but they have access on a schedule, which means they're in a role with predictable access windows. That narrows it significantly, she felt rather than saw him turn to look at her. How long have you known that? He said. Since Wednesday, it's Monday. I wanted to be sure before I said it. Another silence. He turned back to the wall. What else? She told him. She'd been assembling it for days, checking and rechecking, because she'd learned in 12 years of government work that the difference between probably right and demonstrably right was the difference between a finding that held and one that got buried. She showed him the routing codes that repeated in a compressed pattern, the account that functioned as a clearinghouse and had been invisible in summaries because it resolved to 0 on quarter end, the name attached to the access credentials that corresponded to the Tuesday window. She showed him all of it, laid flat on the wall, undeniable. He stood there for a long time without speaking. You found all of this in 5 days, he said. I've had practice with this pattern. The Meridian accounts. Yes. He turned away from the wall and walked to the window that overlooked the narrow garden. She watched him because she'd been watching him for a week, and she'd learned that he thought with his whole body, weight-shifting, jaw-setting, a particular stillness that preceded decisions. The person whose name is on those credentials, he said, has been with me for 9 years. I know. He's family. She hadn't known that. She kept her voice even. Does that change what's in the records? A long pause. No, he said. It sounded like it cost him something. Then it doesn't change what I found. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he turned around, and his face had done the thing she'd noticed it do when something was resolved. Not expressionless, but settled, the way a court settles when the verdict's in and everyone's pretending the outcome is uncertain. Good work, Faris, he said. She turned back to the wall and started pulling down the sheets for the next phase. I'm not finished yet. She was there 3 weeks before she understood what she'd actually walked into. She'd known, in the abstract, the way you know things when you're not asking direct questions because you don't want direct answers. She'd known from the structure of the accounts, legal entities that shouldn't exist together, cash flows that had no plausible legitimate source, the particular shape of money that was being managed rather than earned. She was a forensic accountant. She was not naive, but knowing in the abstract and knowing specifically were different things, and she was standing in the kitchen at 11:30 at night, drinking tea because the coffee had run out and she couldn't sleep, when she overheard the conversation in the adjoining room. Not all of it. Enough. She was still standing there, cup in hand, when the door opened and Harmon walked in and saw her face. He stopped. He looked at her. He seemed to be deciding something. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand, Wren. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She sat down. He sat across from her, and he told her. Not everything. She understood even then that he was telling her what he'd decided she needed to know, and that was its own kind of statement. But he was direct about it, in the way she was coming to understand was simply how he was. No softening, no euphemism, no management of the truth into something more comfortable. He told her what the organization was. He told her what the accounts she'd been auditing actually represented. He told her why the person who'd been skimming was a problem that went beyond money. When he was finished, she was quiet for a moment. You knew I'd figure it out eventually, she said. Yes, so you were waiting to see what I'd do when I did. He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She looked down at her tea. It had gone cold. She thought about Revenue Canada and the Meridian files and her supervisor's face when she'd asked why the file was being closed and how he'd looked at her, like she was asking a question he couldn't believe she was asking. She thought about the 3 missed calls from her landlord. She thought about her mother who had known somehow that the world wasn't what people said it was, and who had never stopped believing Wren could navigate it anyway. The accounts I haven't looked at yet, she said. The ones in the secondary structure, the charitable holding entities. What about them? There's something wrong there too. Different pattern. Older. She wrapped her hands around the cold teacup. It's not skimming, it's something else. Silence. How long have you known? He said. 3 days, I wanted to be sure. She heard him breathe out slowly through his nose. Show me. She showed him. It took 4 hours. By the time she was done, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and the sky outside the window had gone from black to the particular flat grey that preceded Ottawa dawn in November. He'd made more coffee somewhere in the second hour, real coffee this time, not the instant she'd been using, and set a mug in front of her without comment. She'd drunk it without comment. That was how they worked, she'd realized. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, an economy of gesture that suited them both. What she'd found in the secondary structure wasn't theft. It was a leak, slow and deliberate, feeding information to someone outside the organization through the mechanism of the charitable accounts. Patterns of disbursement that encoded routing instructions, visible only if you knew what you were looking at. A dead drop, essentially, built into the financial infrastructure. She showed him the mechanism. She showed him where it started and where it ended, or rather, where the trail ended, which wasn't the same thing as the source, but was close enough to narrow it to 2 or 3 people. He sat back when she was finished. He looked at the wall. You should have left when you figured out what this was, he said. Not accusatory. Observational. Probably. Why didn't you? She thought about it honestly. Because the work isn't finished. He turned to look at her. In the early morning grey, the scar on his cheek looked more pronounced. She'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing things that were simply part of a person's face. That's not a safe answer, Faris. I'm aware. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the people feeding this information, if I'm right about who it is, they have leverage they shouldn't have. Over you. Over this operation. Over people who don't deserve to have it used against them. He turned back to the wall. I've been trying to locate the mechanism for 8 months. My people couldn't find it. Your people weren't looking at the financial layer. No. A pause. You found it in 3 weeks. She didn't say anything to that. If you help me close this, he said carefully, you would be in a position. A position. Someone who knows what you know, who found what you found, doesn't go back to looking for government work. He said it the way he said everything, flatly, without decoration, as a statement of arithmetic. This organization has a gap. The people who've been managing the financial operations for the last several years have been doing so incompetently, and the incompetence has nearly cost us more than money. You're offering me a job. I'm telling you the situation. Wren looked at the wall. The sheets of paper, the colored tape, the 4 hours of work that had mapped something she'd been circling for weeks. She thought about what she was being told, and what it meant, and what the alternative was, which was walking out into the grey Ottawa morning with whatever she knew, and trying to figure out what to do with it. I want the secondary structure dismantled, she said. The leak closed and the mechanism destroyed, not just rerouted. Destroyed. Agreed. And I want to know who I'm actually working for. Not the structure, the person. She met his eyes. I want to know what I'm deciding. He held her gaze. He did this, she'd noticed, held eye contact longer than was comfortable. Not as a power move, but because he was genuinely reading something, and he didn't look away until he'd finished reading it. My name is Callum Harmon, he said. I run a syndicate with operations across 5 cities. I am, by most legal definitions, a criminal. I am also, by the definitions that have ever mattered, to me, a person who keeps his word. A pause. Every person who works for me knows what they work for. I don't keep them in the dark for their comfort. That's the offer. Wren was quiet for a moment. You pay on the 1st of the month, she said. I want the access I asked for. All of it. Yes. And if I find something else, she said. I tell you. Not your accountants. Not your lieutenants. You. Agreed. She turned back to the wall and picked up a red marker. Then let me show you where I think the 3rd account is. She found it in 4 days. The 3rd account was the oldest. buried in a structure that predated the organization's current form by almost a decade, and it was running a variance that nobody had ever flagged because it was small enough to be invisible in any single quarter, and had been accumulating for so long that it had become, in the accountant's mind, simply how the numbers were. A background assumption. An accepted imprecision. She had no patience for accepted imprecision. The account traced back to a name that made Harmon go still in a way she hadn't seen before, not the considered stillness of a decision being made, but the sudden stillness of impact. She watched it happen from across the room and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and she'd learned that with him, silence was not abandonment. She gave him the file. She gave him everything she'd documented. Clean, organized, sourced to the original transaction records, irrefutable, the kind of evidence that didn't need interpretation, that spoke for itself in the language of numbers, which was the only language she'd ever fully trusted. He read it for a long time. "His name is on the founding charter," he said. "I know. He's been with me since the beginning." "I know that too." She kept her voice even. "I'm sorry." He looked up at that. She wasn't sure why she'd said it. She wasn't in the habit of offering condolences. She found them usually more about the giver than the receiver. But she'd meant it, which was the test she used. He held her gaze for a moment. "You've been thorough," he said. "I'm always thorough. I've noticed." He set the file on the table. He rubbed one hand over his jaw, briefly, a rare concession to visible tiredness. "This took courage. Bringing this to me directly. It's what you asked for. It's what I asked for," he said. "It's not nothing, Faris." She looked away first, which was unusual for her. She looked at the window, at the grey Ottawa sky that had been grey for 3 weeks and showed no particular intention of changing. She thought about the cardboard box on the sidewalk on Elgin Street, and how light it had been, and how she'd stood there in the cold trying to figure out what came next. She'd found it. She'd found what came next. It didn't look anything like she'd imagined. It was better in the ways that mattered, and stranger in the ways she was still getting used to. But she'd learned in 31 years that the things worth doing almost never looked the way you expected them to. The man who had been running the third account walked into the office on a Wednesday, the way he apparently always did on Wednesdays, because he'd been doing it for 9 years, and it had never once occurred to him that anything could change. Wren was not in the room when Harmon spoke with him. She sat in the kitchen with her coffee and her files, and the running tally of the Q4 accounts she'd been restructuring, because that was her work and the other thing was his. She heard it end. She didn't go to the window. An hour later, Harmon came into the kitchen. He set his coffee cup on the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, the way he did when he was sorting through something internally that hadn't finished sorting. She refilled his cup without being asked. He accepted it without comment. "The secondary accounts," he said after a moment. "The restructuring you've been designing. I can have a proposal to you by Friday. I'd like to understand the mechanism before it's implemented. I was going to walk you through it anyway." He turned to look at her. Something in his expression had shifted, not opened exactly, but adjusted, the way a calculation adjusted when new data changed the variables. She'd been watching his face for weeks now, and she'd gotten good at reading what it didn't say. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "You've said that before. I'll probably say it again." "I know." She picked up her own cup. "The answer is the same." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, it had finally started to snow. The first real snow of the season, coming down in the heavy, deliberate way of something that intended to stick. She watched it for a moment through the window. "The Meridian accounts," he said. "The ones you flagged at Revenue Canada. What about them? The structure you described, the layering pattern. I know whose work that is." She turned to look at him. "It's not the same family as what's been running through my books," he said. "It's adjacent, a competitor operation, moving money through the same kind of charitable holding structure you found the secondary accounts. You think they're connected. I think you'd know better than I would if you saw the full picture." She set her cup down. She looked at him steadily. He looked back, with those pale blue eyes that had stopped being unreadable to her several weeks ago. Or not unreadable, but legible in a way she'd had to learn, the way you learned a second language until the grammar stopped feeling foreign and started feeling simply like another way of saying what was true. "Show me the Meridian files," she said. He reached into the folder he'd carried in and set them on the table between them. She pulled them toward her, opened the first page, and started to read. The snow outside came down steady and heavy, covering the narrow garden, covering the street, covering the city in the particular silence of a Canadian winter that changed everything it touched. She turned the page. She was not finished yet. She had a feeling she wouldn't be for a long time, and she found, to her own mild surprise, that this did not trouble her at all. The numbers were still moving, still changing clothes and crossing the street and sitting down somewhere else. She would find them. She always did. She turned another page, and the work continued.